Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our second session of the afternoon of the PONToon Virtual Symposium. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Louis Netter. I'll say a few words of introduction about him in a moment, but I'll just say for the benefit of people who sort of haven't been to any of these sessions so far today, just a little bit about the structure. Louis is going to talk for a little while, do his presentation, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. You can either type them in the chat box or deliver them spoken word to him. So Louis, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He's a practicing illustrator who has contributed to various aspects of the PONToon project since its very beginning. Louis has over 15 years of experience, and his satirical illustration has been published in magazines and books. His artwork is collected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Library of Congress, amongst other collections in the US. Recently, a comic collaboration with Ollie Gruner was published in the Corbin comic, Self-Made Hero. He holds a PhD from the Royal College of Art in reportage drawing and is exploring further practice-based research in comic as research projects following the publication of Steal This History in the journal Rethinking History, published by Taylor and Francis. Other practice-based research is exploring community outreach and lived experience through art making in Nairobi slums, arts and resilience in South Sudan, and the factors that impact violence against women in Southeast Asia. And I will hand over to Louis now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. And I will crack on here, share my screen. Now, I know there was some initial thought this might be about sort of arts and lockdown and so forth, but this is actually really looking at the comic. I created a comic for the PONToon project, and this is really looking at a few things. One, the comic's sort of function, the comic's relevance today, and what I think is particularly relevant to the PONToon project in general is how the comic has really been embraced by women to tell their own story, to explore the realm of different issues affecting women specifically, and also how globally the comic has been used to explore kind of untold stories of women's experience in parts of the world and in contexts which we don't often hear about. So the comic has played a vital role in telling these stories, which have largely been untold and, I guess, relating to the comic, unseen. So the comic itself, and also just to preface before, what I also intend this particular talk to do is to demonstrate also some of the real benefits of exploring the comic in advocacy and in terms of sharing, I think, quite critical ideas and narratives with the wider public. And there are unique properties to the comic which I think make it a highly effective medium in doing that. And that's really the core of what I'm really trying to kind of get across. And then obviously really demonstrate the role of women in the comic field, which is enormous actually. So the comic, it's not just for pimply teens with flashlights, which seems to be the image of the comic book at least in film particularly, but also in kind of a popular culture perspective, this idea of superheroes and all that sort of stuff, and these kind of this teenage this teenage pursuit, and in some ways the kind of the nerd who perhaps can't engage with real life dives into the kind of comic and has this adventure and rich experience, but only in the sort of stained pages of the comic and not so much in actual real life. The superhero's decline is womankind's triumph. This is a strange thing to say, but in a way it's kind of true. There is a shift in the comic from the superhero genre and a lot of the conventions around that towards essentially more personal narratives, and even the comic as a literary form. The the comic gives us everything and more than film without the eye-watering budget, of course. Comics do take a lot of time to make, however, at least for the practitioner. Sometimes there's more than one practitioner, but typically there's one, usually working with a writer, but occasionally, and in many instances, the artists write and draw the comic. But also there's more movability in the comic. It's kind of flexibly go anywhere, and it makes sense. So unlike the sort of more linear aspects of film, even although there are experimental approaches to film and so forth, the comic can very easily erase some of those kind of conventions and senses and any sense of linearity or the requirement of linearity. Sensitive issues can be sensitively and humanely portrayed and understood in the comic. I'll talk a little bit about why that is later. The possibility of the comic, possibilities of the comic are only just being kind of fully explored now. And really the growth of the comic and the comic industry and the movements in the comic industry could really usher in a sort of new kind of expansive visual literacy. And in some ways, the old arguments against the comic, which were that it was essentially promoting illiteracy, are, in some ways founded. I mean, they're not founded. There are, of course, words to be read in the comic and so forth, but we are looking at a shift in literacy towards a kind of visual literacy, and we're certainly living in a very visual world, undoubtedly. By the way, if there's anything in the chat, we'll get to that a little bit later because I can't really do that and do this at the same time. So important stories are being shared and told in comic format, in the comic format worldwide, and women have been some of the most active practitioners and or subjects of those comics. So the state of comics and the state of women in comics. Two examples come to mind, and interestingly enough, they're probably the most kind of critically lauded comics of the past sort of 20 years, really. One being Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which was National Book Critics Circle Award, won the National Book Critics Circle Award and 3 Eisner Awards. Also a New York Times bestseller. Also a New York Times bestseller was Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I was lucky enough to hear Marjane speak in a university in New York, and she is just like her character, whip smart, passionate, incredibly imaginative, brilliant woman. And if you've ever read Persepolis, which I highly recommend, you will really see such an interesting inside look at what it feels like, and how an independent mind can navigate through the kind of restrictions of society. In this case, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And so now the shift in comics has really taken this form probably over the last sort of 30 years. I would say Mouse was a key comic in moving towards more adventurous, interesting, idiosyncratic, and literary approaches to the comic. And this article in Forbes really sort of talks about, of course, being Forbes, really the money shift in comics away from the superhero. It says, meanwhile, despite the media dominance of superheroes on every screen, the superhero side of the publishing business has been mired in a slump, the culmination of a decade-long market trend and a demographic shift in the audience for graphic literature. So there is a move, at least in people purchasing comics, there's a move away from the superhero, men in tights, towards more nuanced stories, personal stories, stories about histories which are lesser known, and including histories and narratives around Black Lives Matter, and women's stories, women's autobiography, and narratives, and variety of different issues around that. So how does the comic work? Well, the comic initially works because it easily defies the expectation, because nobody expects much from a comic, really, because it's thought as being kind of puerile and juvenile. So immediately, if you're doing anything other than that, you're going to get some attention because, oh, actually, this is not about men in tights jumping around, or zombies kind of taking over some kind of Hollywood set. And the comic functions because, a bit like a film, we trust in the authority of the artist. We trust in the fact that the comic is a construct. The artist has constructed this experience for us. So no matter where all the crazy places that the artist takes you, and I like to take you to all sorts of crazy places in my usual artwork, which this one here, it's about a town in southern France that was dosed with LSD, supposedly, Saint-Esprit. But that we go through that gutter, that space in between each panel. We take a large leap each time we go from panel to panel. And in the comic, there's so much potential in what we can do with that trust that the reader has, the viewer has, in the artist and in their construction in the comic. Drawings also gain this kind of other level of our understanding and attention, because they're naturally abstractions. A drawing isn't something. It's a set of symbols arranged to be depictive of something. So it automatically is a symbol. It's a symbol of something. It stands in for the real thing. And this kind of separation from the actual object, the specificity of depiction of a real person, as in the photograph, means that we always see the image and the comic image as a symbol, and on the level of symbolism and metaphor, which can really be used to advantage when we're dealing with very sensitive issues, which, if there was photographic images of, say, sexual abuse and a variety of, just as an example, that would be very difficult to see photographically, where some of these things were sensitively portrayed and effectively portrayed in the comic, and not in a demeaning way, but also engendering a lot of compassion and sympathy. Comics also require participation. Because of this, they create a kind of intimate space. Scott McCloud, who wrote a very influential book called Understanding Comics, notes, we don't just observe the cartoon, we become it. We fall into the world that the artist has created, because the artist has created a world that is the sum of a symbol set, which is drawing. So we buy into that space. And by buying into that space, we become kind of intimate partners in assembling knowledge, assembling the kind of meaning behind all these different drawings and so forth. Also, the comic is great because it's an open stylistic playground. You can go from things which some people may deem very good, good drawing. There can be artful drawing, there can be very stylized drawing, there can be crude drawing, but they all sort of work if they're put into a kind of context and constructed in an appropriate way. The conventions in the comic are kind of dead, and I think they should be, although sometimes they do come back. The comic that I did for PONToon was really exploring a story from a real interview that I did with an anonymous person about their struggle with addiction, alcohol addiction primarily, but also other things that sort of surrounded that, including unresolved trauma and so forth. And part of that too was telling a little bit briefly that sort of story of Portsmouth too, the backdrop. And the comic really allows broad contextualization. And it's a space where the images tell us a lot, and as do the words, but they kind of riff off each other. And in this case, Portsmouth really sort of suffers a lot of the same struggles as the central character in the comic. So it was an interesting way of exploring the space and the people of Portsmouth and kind of relating that to the subject of the interview. And in that sense as well, again, avoiding specificity, we can tell a story which is touching on broader issues, which opens the story up as opposed to closing it down with specific characters. And in this particular kind of montage, it's really about when the character is working with families and these different stories that come up in her counseling as a family sort of counselor, that they sort of strike a chord with her, that in some ways the work that she's doing, which is important and valuable, is bringing up difficult things for the character to confront in her own experience, in her own life, including addiction, violence, sleeping rough, and the last being an allusion to sort of sexual molestation and so forth. So this is what the comic kind of does well with images instead of words, but with words as well. We get a opening up of more of an interpretive space where the reader brings much more of themselves into the assembling the meaning behind these particular images and the sort of full content of the story. It's an immersive experience. Also in this particular comic, which is true of comics, I brought myself kind of into the comic. I'm thinking of myself as a sort of weary academic here, plodding around Eldon Building when you could do such things, and going in and interviewing my subject here. There is a lot of this in the comic. It almost invites this meta dialogue that can happen, whether it's a self-awareness of the author or artist, or it's an awareness of the form and playing on the form to perhaps fold in other layers of your narrative, or perhaps even other narratives embedded within it, and so forth. An important part of the comic, which is unique to the form as well, is time. So we can go from large expanse of time where images fill in wide, years and years. A single image can represent an entire year or multiple years and so forth, or it can just represent an object or part of a sentence. But then that time can slow considerably for poetic emphasis. And in this particular case, I had that because this is an important part of the story. And there's also a kind of folding back to this because the character talks about everything being fine at this particular point: employment, a home, a nice car, and holidays. And then we slow the time down. If only I could just hold on. And this is really this point of addiction. And so it's a kind of foreshadowing of what is about to kind of happen, this holding on to those things that you've just achieved. But that addiction sort of pulls everything away from you. And in the comic, the poetics of that, what Barthes calls a sort of relay between text and image, can really be used to heighten the emotional impact of what you're doing. Not just emotional impact, but really kind of confirming some of the ideas that you're exploring within the comic. The comic as well is a medium where you show and you don't tell. You do tell, of course there's words and so forth, but the image is doing a lot more than the words are. The words are there as a kind of prompt, as a springboard, and as something that sets off the image. So the image is the priority, and the image is the thing where we find and generate and form the vast majority of the sort of meaning behind the comic. That's where the impact really is in terms of us understanding what's happening, who's it happening to, and why we should feel that particular character's experience. And here we have also different kind of symbolism used. This doll is almost representing her daughter here, or perhaps even maybe a recollection of something that her daughter played with. And these different dynamics of kind of in and out and loneliness and isolation. And again, the metaphor being used here as a large snake. which is not the most original metaphor. I'll realize, I kind of completely understand that. But and then rock bottom, this moment in the comic where the character has had enough, where it's so much has been lost. And there's so much desperation between being essentially homeless to being in another hostel. Actually, previous to this, she was in a home which she had been to when she was a teenager as well. So a lot of kind of repetition sort of happening in this story. Most of it sort of negative, lots of things happening, losing children, this sort of repeated pattern. And the character now finally making a choice to find some kind of some way to come back, to crawl back to a life where she could kind of assert some control. And the comic really allows for this entry into the most personal and uncomfortable places. We share that experience, but we can build an incredible amount of empathy. And the comic, because it's visual, can also give us the essential sort of textures of that experience as well, which are kind of highly unique. You get this same thing in film. But as I said before, in film, we specify that those textures of experience. We specify that empathy because it's on a specific person, an actor or actress, what they're experiencing at that particular point. But the comic blows that up. It's more universal. We don't think of this one specific person, this thing happening to this one person. We do, but we can also very easily, because of the symbolic language of the comic, extend that to people suffering with addiction in a much more sort of a globalized way. And in the comic as well, difficult things to talk about are not, there can be subtlety, great subtlety in the comic. And here really with words and languages, really talking about this concept of unresolved trauma. And how can unresolved trauma, something which is very abstract, be visualized? How can we kind of understand it in a visual way? And how throughout the narrative can it kind of crop up? And I sort of use this idea of a shadow, but it also kind of comes up in different forms. It comes up in this sort of repetitive behavior of the characters, of the interviewees, always seeking some kind of escape without perhaps even acknowledging that or being aware of that. So always sort of trying to sort of distract herself and pushing herself away from other people. Now, the comic has been used to tell, as I mentioned before, stories of people all over the world who have suffered from a variety of different things due to war, due to patriarchal societies, due to religious extremism, and so on and so forth. And oftentimes these narratives have focused on women, largely because in the wider reporting of events such as conflict, whether that be in sort of Central Africa or the Middle East and so forth, we often think of that in terms of nation states fighting each other and men sort of dying or different things. But what we really lose is this story, women's role in those stories. And a lot of that is women suffer enormously, not just from the direct effect of war, but the post-war psychological damage with partners, with family members, reassembling the family and so forth. So there's a tremendous amount of stress and difficulty put on women. And there have been many, many attempts to explore these issues in comics in particular, comics and animation. And probably for your own benefit, if you're interested in this particular subject, is take a look at positivenegatives.org. It's an incredible organization which hooks up professional artists and animators, and in some cases filmmakers, with people in a variety of different contexts dealing with a variety of different issues, women's health, post-conflict zones, so on and so forth. And they team up these artists with these women and men and young people and tell their stories in very compelling ways, using their own expertise. And actually, my own interest in this is to remove maybe perhaps that professional element, and through a period of time to really train people on the ground to develop their own comics, which I think would be a much more interesting thing, which I'll show you a little bit about later. These are some more comics from Positive Negative. They really span the world. This one here is India. I believe the previous one was Africa. And this here to the right is a UK-based comic, which is using the comic, again, something the comic does very well, is condensing complex information, making it visual and making it understandable. And here they're really looking at the process it takes to become a citizen from an immigrant's sort of perspective, the immigrant journey, essentially. So the comic does offer this incredible way of condensing knowledge, simplifying knowledge, but again, in the simplification, it's also opening up lots of other interesting complexities. Many of those complexities and many of those choices being artistic in terms of composition, depiction, stylization, color use, cultural sensitivity, variety of different interesting issues which play an enormous role in not only how we read the comic, but how different audiences read and understand the comic, which I think is actually quite fascinating because, of course, from a Western perspective, we have a certain visual literacy. We're used to a certain visual vocabulary, but in other countries and contexts, it's dramatically different. This is certainly true with depiction, but it's also true with color use and so on and so forth. Most recently, I was involved with Cressida Bauer in Nairobi, a place that we've been working on other projects, but we created this very, very short project during lockdown called ACT, Action Against Coronavirus Transmission. And I was sort of tasked to facilitate the creation of comics with local artists, some more sort of seasoned than others. And really the idea here was to get a sense of from the ground, how people were dealing with, coping with a variety of issues around coronavirus, around understanding the difference between fact and fiction, superstition, what you might call fake news, perhaps. But here it's more sort of word of mouth is really how some of these falsehoods were spreading. And this particular comic is by Mika, who created quite a few comics, actually about four comics in the end that he created himself. Very industrious guy on the ground in Kuru, which is a slum in Nairobi of about 350,000 people. I've been there several times, an incredible, vibrant place, and the kind of place that when you're there, you really do think, like the Positive Negatives, you think this is a rich place for narrative, a rich place for stories that the world really would benefit immensely from hearing, because these are incredibly complex, interesting, and vibrant communities, which can really offer us a lot. So this particular comic really looked at and a lot of different approaches. This one is sort of women hanging up some washing, and one person sort of having a cough and then worrying about that, and then eventually going to the doctor and so forth. And then here we have a comic which really focuses on young people, their perception and misperceptions about coronavirus transmission and so forth. So the comic is also this liberating space where you can start to tell your own story with the right tools, And you can see here, there's not an enormous amount of polish necessarily, but these are pretty impressive comics actually. But with some of the right skills, with some of the right guidance, you can own this story. You can own these stories, you can tell the stories, and then you can disseminate these stories. And that it was one of the most exciting aspects of being a part of this particular project. One of the projects, which is a global project and globally distributed as well, is Menstrupedia, which is a comic for girls, which is all about menstrual cycle and so forth. And this has global reach and has been used in a variety of different countries around the world. So the comic has really played this role in, again, telling what in some communities, and this is also an issue in Nairobi as well, is women's menstruation. There are some organizations focusing on this specific issue there as well in terms of educating the public. And you can see here, this particular comic is attempting to do so. But this is where the comic really does well. Difficult, sometimes sensitive subjects can really be told clearly and sensitively in the comic, and this is a great benefit of the particular medium. There are also comics and comic publishers which are moving and shifting in the world of research. There are also comics being made that perhaps would have initially been sort of typical books, printed books of just words on a page, are now being translated by artists and teams of writers to be graphic novels. And University of Toronto has a print called Ethnographic, and they're creating a series of graphic novels which are really looking at sort of ethnographic studies. And in these comics, you can really see the strength of the comic being used. There's sort of multiple narratives kind of coming under, but also the very clever use of imagery too, to suggest certain themes and suggest certain metaphoric ideas, which is particularly interesting to see being used in a research arena. So yes, multiple narratives can coexist. And yes, as I noted before, behind this kind of construction, behind what we see in the comic is this construction. And it's a consequential construction of depiction, characterization, symbol, metaphor, and so forth. And this is an interesting area that I find, because unlike most research, you can't control how people perceive images. You can't control how people assemble knowledge. And this is something which is very much a requirement of looking at the comic. This is a comic called Lisa, which really is a fascinating comic exploring two different medical narratives. One being, basically they're two friends living in Egypt. One friend moves away to America, and the other friend is left there with an ailing father. And she's kind of telling her about her father's issues, medical issues. And this girl who went to America actually started suffering from some medical issues of her own. And this comparison of these two medical narratives treated with in different systems is really explored here. But interestingly enough, the backdrop of this narrative is the Arab Spring. So we have this amazing graphic novel which does justice to these two different stories of medical treatment, and also highlights this incredible moment of political upheaval in the Middle East. This other book here, there are a lot of examples of things happening in terms of narrative and comics, and even something which kind of goes beyond what might be traditionally understood as comics. A book called I Live Here, which I also highly recommend if you're interested in this particular subject. It's published in cooperation with Amnesty International, but published by PONToon in 2008, and explores a series of stories, photographic montage, written stories, diaries from 4 different locations around the world. largely focusing on the experience of women and of areas which are often forgotten, certainly do not make the nightly news. But this Phoebe Glockner's work really interests me. And she's doing this work on Juarez and has created these elaborate 3D constructions, and very much focusing on sexual violence in Juarez, which is a border city in Mexico. So it's incredibly powerful work. And some of this work down here. Also, this was produced with help of designers and artists who've created Adbusters. So this is very much designed by the Adbusters team. So it has a particularly impressive graphic and adventurous kind of look and feel. And Phoebe Glockner as well, Diary of a Teenage Girl, which I would also highly recommend and fits in very much with what I've said about the comic being this space where you can reveal so much intimacy, share so much intimacy, and involve yourself as a reader and as a maker of comics. I mean, I make comics that they're very involving things because you're involved in so many choices in the making of a comic, but you're involved in so many choices in the reading of comics as well, in terms of how you think about characters. Again, how you assemble meaning based on these particular images, and how you're propelled from one page to the next, putting together the stories and so forth. So that is really it for my talk. I would like to kind of hear from the audience here, if there's any people, about their perceptions of comics, maybe how they see comics and advocacy going together, but also perhaps some comics you might recommend to me that perhaps share intimate experiences of people in lesser known parts of the world and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louis. That was brilliant. From really interesting about sort of looking at comics as this kind of global or universal language, or a universal form, where there seems to be a kind of iteration of comics in lots of different cultures, and no doubt there are long traditions to that as well. And then also I thought your taking us through the creative process for the PONToon comic book was really fascinating as well. I think we've got time for probably one question, if anyone would like to come in with a question or a comment or a recommendation, as Louis was saying. Well, I've got loads of questions because I love comics, and I've worked with Louis on projects before. So maybe I'll just start. I'd like to know more about that creative process that you went through, because I take it you interviewed the woman that you sort of depicted in the PONToon comic, and I just wondered, as a writer who bases a lot of his work on kind of interviews, and like you, I've traveled to use and those sort of testimonies from people. When you came to take the sort of story or elements of the story that you needed from the interview to create the comic book, what sort of how did you sort of decide what to use and what not to? Were there certain kind of issues? I know you couldn't use her real name. Were there other issues around kind of ethics and sensitivity that kind of informed your decisions about that? Or
Yeah, it was a difficult thing, and I actually found creating the comic to be well, quite heartbreaking, because the story is quite kind of heartbreaking. Although the interview really showed an incredible amount of resilience from the interviewee. So, and I think it was a matter of, number one, depiction-wise, is very much changing what the character sort of looked like and so forth, but also breaking the story down and thinking about the things that work narratively, like repeating motifs, setting up certain things, elements of foreshadowing, and then sort of resolution, in a sense, kind of folding back to a kind of beginning. The end is kind of like the beginning, and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was, I think actually oftentimes in comics, there's a perception that the comic artist has to be overly sensitive in terms of depiction and that sort of stuff. But actually, because of the nature of making art, if you were so overly conscious about those choices, you couldn't kind of create effective art. So you kind of have to have much more of an intuitive approach, trusting your intuition and making those decisions based on your own. And my students have these issues with dealing with sensitive subjects. And so I often kind of guide them to, think about your reader, think about yourself. Do you think this is the most sensitive way? If this was your story, would you want it to be depicted that way?
Mm.
And I don't think you can't shy away from the intense and the intense emotional landscape of the story, and you have to be true to that, but you can't be explicit to the point of it becoming kind of meaningless or distracting. I think it's about it being distracting, I think, for me.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. I wish, because as I said, I'm a comics fan, so I'd happily spend all afternoon, all night, preferably over a beer, talking about this. But unfortunately, we do have to stop there. Thanks so much, Louis, for your contribution to the symposium and also to the project generally, because you've done a lot for PONToon. And thank you also to everyone for coming along. Louis, if people wanted to sort of follow up with you, maybe contact you, get some more recommendations, some ideas, would that be okay if they emailed you perhaps or found you on social media?
Yeah, you can email me at I'll just put it right here in the chat. You can email me there, no problem at all.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again and take care, everybody. We have more, you'll find more talks coming up. If you want to join them, we hope that you do. All right.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.